Marina Solovyova had long since grown accustomed to the endless rhythm of the intensive care unit, where alarms never ceased and the line between life and death was measured in seconds. Years of sleepless nights, frantic resuscitations, and the constant weight of responsibility had dulled her sense of wonder. The language of machines, the fractured cries of patients, and the metallic echo of footsteps in sterile corridors had become her only music. Yet in the silence of her apartment, after another grueling shift, she felt a void that no routine could fill. That night, long after she had collapsed into bed, the silence was broken by a sound that did not belong. The shrill ring of her service phone tore through the stillness. She stared at it in confusion, because the phone should not have been functional at all. It had been disconnected weeks ago when the hospital replaced their communication system. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, but her instincts as a doctor forced her to pick up the receiver. On the other end, there was no voice, no request for help, no frantic demand. Instead, she heard a faint breathing, steady and unnerving, followed by a sound that lingered on the edge of familiarity. It was not static, nor was it interference. It pulsed slowly, rhythmically, like the echo of a heartbeat captured on faulty equipment. She listened in tense silence until the line went dead, leaving her staring into the darkened room with a feeling that something had shifted around her. Sleep never returned that night. The shadows across her walls seemed heavier, the silence that followed the call more profound than the noise itself. Her mind raced through explanations, a crossed line, a cruel prank, even a hallucination born from exhaustion. But none of them settled the unease that burrowed into her chest. She thought of the countless monitors she had watched over the years, each heartbeat traced in green light. The sound from the call had carried the same cadence, but it lacked warmth, as if life had been hollowed out of it. The following morning, drained and restless, she left her apartment for the hospital. In the crowded corridors of the city, everything seemed unusually sharp, as if the world was waiting for her to notice something hidden beneath its surface. When she reached the staff entrance, a plain envelope awaited her at the reception desk. It bore no address, no handwriting, only her name typed in stark black letters. She felt an immediate chill, as though the weight of the envelope was far greater than its thin paper suggested. Inside was a single radiographic image, its glossy surface reflecting the harsh fluorescent light. She recognized the blurred shakes of ribs and lungs, but across the film ran markings that made no sense. Jagged lines, circles, and notations scrawled in a hand that seemed both precise and frenzied. At the bottom corner was a date. It was not the day's date, nor any from the past. It was a date yet to come, etched with an unsettling finality. Marina held the film up against the light, searching for reason in the chaotic symbols. The lungs appeared normal at first glance, but the longer she looked, the more she thought she saw patterns hidden within the shadows, as though figures or shapes pressed against the translucent surface. She lowered it quickly, unsettled by her own imagination, yet the chill in her chest remained. For hours she tried to dismiss the discovery, burying herself in her duties. The hospital was filled with the usual chaos, patients arriving breathless, machines calling for attention, colleagues moving with mechanical efficiency. But the memory of the call and the strange film followed her like an echo. Each monitor's rhythmic beeping reminded her of the phantom heartbeat she had heard through the phone. Each chest X-ray she examined that day seemed to carry faint whispers of the same markings, though she knew they were not really there. By the time her shift ended, exhaustion had dulled her resolve, yet she could not shake the thought that she had been summoned. The phone call, the envelope, the image with its impossible date, together they formed something more than coincidence. It felt like a thread had been placed in her hand, leading into a labyrinth she had no choice but to enter. As she walked home through the deepening night, the city's lights shimmered with a strange unreality, and every shadow seemed to breathe. Marina realized that what had begun as an intrusion of silence was in truth a call, not to save, but to confront something that medicine alone could never explain. The following day, Marina received a call that unsettled her more than the strange envelope. It came through the hospital's internal system, her name clearly marked as the only recipient. The request instructed her to report not to her usual ward, but to the old wing of the city hospital, a section that had been closed for years due to ongoing renovations and structural decay. She reread the message several times, certain it must have been a mistake. That wing had been locked, its patients transferred, its equipment dismantled. Still, the instruction was precise, and the unease she carried from the night before urged her to follow. She crossed the hospital grounds in the early hours of the morning. The old building stood in stark contrast to the modern complex, its windows dark and streaked with years of neglect. The once white walls were stained with soot and rainwater, giving it the air of an abandoned asylum. As she stepped inside, a heavy silence greeted her. Dust lingered in the shafts of weak light that filtered through cracks in the boarded windows. The corridor smelled of disinfectant long evaporated, mingled with damp plaster and something older, the faint memory of medicine left to spoil. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally, bouncing off peeling paint and hollow doors. She expected emptiness, yet the stillness carried a weight, as though unseen eyes followed her. Most rooms were locked or filled with broken furniture, their nameplates long faded. But at the far end of the corridor, one door stood ajar, a narrow band of light spilling into the hall. Marina hesitated before pushing it open. Inside, the room was strangely intact. A single lamp burned above a bed, casting a pale glow over the space. The sheets were clean, arranged with clinical precision, though the dust on the floor suggested no one had walked here in years. On the bed lay a man, motionless yet not lifeless. His face was calm, almost serene, as if he had been waiting. There were no identification bracelets on his wrist, no records clipped to the frame, nothing to indicate who he was or why he had been placed here. Marina approached cautiously, her training guiding her even as her mind screamed that something was wrong. She checked his vitals with the equipment at hand. Blood pressure steady, pulse regular, breathing deep and unlabored. Every sign pointed to health, yet he did not respond, his eyes closed in an unbroken sleep. She called out his condition in routine phrases, but the silence pressed harder against her ears. He existed in a state between awareness and absence, a body that lived without inhabiting itself. She searched the room for clues. Beside the bed stood an old metal cabinet. Its door groaned as she pulled it open, revealing a folder neatly stacked among scattered supplies. Inside were medical records, each sheet marked with the names of patients she remembered vividly. They were people she had treated years ago, individuals whose faces still flickered in her memory. She flipped through page after page, her unease growing with every line. The records claimed these patients had died, but not when or where she recalled. Dates were shifted, causes altered, circumstances rewritten. It was as though their histories had been bent out of shape, reshaped to fit an unfamiliar pattern. The final pages bore her own handwriting, or something indistinguishable from it, though she had no memory of writing these notes. The strokes of the pen were sharp, deliberate, echoing her style yet marked by something colder. At the bottom of each entry was a notation she had never used, a symbol resembling a circle split by a jagged line. She closed the folder with trembling hands, feeling as though she had stumbled upon a ledger of rewritten destinies. The man on the bed remained still, untouched by her presence, yet his existence seemed tied to the files in the cabinet. She felt as though he embodied the distortion of time and memory recorded on the pages. Marina sat for a long moment at his side, her eyes drawn to the faint rise and fall of his chest, the perfect regularity of his body's functions. It was not sleep, nor coma, nor anything she could classify. It was a state that rejected her knowledge, and yet demanded her attention. The silence of the room thickened, broken only by the low hum of the lamp above. She realized she had crossed into a place where medicine alone could not explain what she saw. The hospital, the records, the man without a name, together they formed a chamber where memory, time, and science collapsed into something unfamiliar. And yet, deep within, she felt the same weight she had felt when holding the envelope, that she had been summoned here for a reason, and that reason had been waiting long before she arrived. Marina left the silent room of the old hospital wing with the weight of unanswered questions pressing against her chest. The image of the man who lay breathing without waking clung to her thoughts, refusing to fade. He was not just a patient, he was a fragment of something larger, a presence that tied itself to her memory of past lives she had tried to save. She knew she would not find answers by staring at him, so she turned to the only place that had ever given her direction, the archives. The hospital's archive room was buried beneath layers of dust and disuse. She unlocked the heavy door with her clearance and was struck by the smell of old paper mixed with the faint metallic tang of rusted shelves. Piles of cardboard boxes leaned precariously against each other, each marked with dates and case numbers. She had been here many times before, often in search of past reports, but never with the same sense of dread that now guided her hands. She began pulling files from the shelves, searching for the names she had seen in the folder by the man's bed. At first, she thought exhaustion clouded her judgment, but the more she read, the more she realized that the records had changed. Some files were missing entirely, leaving only gaps in the alphabetical order where they should have been. Others bore the same names she remembered, but the details inside were altered. A patient she recalled stabilizing after a heart failure was now listed as deceased within hours of arrival. Another, whose recovery had been slow but certain, was marked as having succumbed to an unknown condition. The handwriting in the reports was consistent with the hospital staff, yet the outcomes no longer matched reality. The deeper she went into the archives, the stronger the inconsistencies grew. Diseases that had no place in medical textbooks appeared suddenly in charts. Diagnoses referenced symptoms that had never occurred in her patients, at least not in her recollection. She read of fevers that left no trace in laboratory work, of lungs collapsing without trauma, of bodies shutting down in perfect rhythm as though following a predetermined script. These accounts disturbed her more than the deaths themselves. They suggested not mistakes, but a deliberate rewriting of events. One detail returned again and again, and soon it consumed her attention. In the corner of several records, just above the signature line, was a mark. At first, it seemed a careless scrawl, a line drawn in haste. But as she compared page after page, she saw the pattern. The symbol was shaped like a wave, a sharp line rising and falling, almost identical to a segment of an electrocardiogram. It was never explained in the documents, never referenced, yet it repeated across too many cases to be meaningless. Her heart quickened when she placed one of the altered records beside the X-ray photograph she had received in the mysterious envelope. The same jagged line had been faintly inked across the corner of the image, as though branding it. The realization struck her with sudden clarity. Whoever had marked the X-ray had also infiltrated the archives, leaving the same trace, as if to connect all these cases into one design. The patients were not random. They had been chosen, each one marked before their end, as though someone had decided their fates in advance. She leaned against the metal shelf, the paper trembling in her hands. The quiet of the archive room deepened, broken only by the distant hum of the hospital above. The sense of intrusion overwhelmed her. She felt not only as if she were reading forbidden truths, but also as if the documents were reading her in return, measuring her presence as she uncovered the patterns. As she flipped through the last folder, a chill coursed through her. Her own name appeared in one of the lists. The entry was brief, marked by the same jagged line, though the space for her outcome remained blank. Unlike the others, it bore no description, no diagnosis, only the mark of inevitability. It was not a prediction of illness nor of death, but of inclusion, as if she too had been drafted into the cycle she was desperately trying to decode. She placed the files back on the shelf with deliberate care, though her hands resisted letting them go. Her mind raced with possibilities. Had the man in the abandoned ward been the embodiment of this cycle, a vessel for all those rewritten lives? Or was he merely the beginning, the silent testimony to an ongoing process that no one else dared to acknowledge? Marina wheeled the portable monitor into the abandoned ward with hands that trembled more from anticipation than fatigue. The man on the bed had not moved in days, his chest rising and falling with mechanical steadiness, as though his body obeyed a rhythm detached from the living world. She set up the equipment with clinical precision, attaching electrodes to his chest, calibrating the sensors, and watching the green line pulse across the screen. At first, the readings were unremarkable. Blood pressure within range, pulse steady, oxygen saturation normal. Nothing about him justified his endless sleep. She dimmed the overhead lamp, leaving only the glow of the monitor to fill the room with pale light. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the low hum of the machines. She fought off drowsiness, determined to witness whatever anomaly might emerge. Then, sometime past midnight, the steady pattern on the screen began to change. The line did not simply rise and fall in its usual cadence. It shivered, split, and multiplied. Sudden bursts of activity flared across the display, lines overlapping one another as if several hearts beat at once through a single body. Marina leaned forward, her breath caught in her throat. She recognized the irregular signatures. They belonged to other patients, people she had once fought to keep alive, some for minutes, others for months. Their names came to her unbidden, each rhythm calling out from her memory. The screen became a palimpsest of lives, stacked on top of one another, merging into something she could barely comprehend. The beeping tones shifted, no longer mechanical but almost musical. Rhythms overlapped, weaving a dissonant melody that filled the room with something far removed from hospital machinery. It was not random noise. It was structured, layered like voices in a choir, each heartbeat resonating against the others until they formed a chorus of the lost. Marina's skin prickled, her pulse racing in sync with the sounds. Then she heard it. Her name, embedded within the patterns, hidden but unmistakable. The syllables stretched across the mechanical hum, not spoken but pulsing, carved into the very rhythm of the signals. It was as though the machines themselves had chosen to address her directly, folding her identity into the song of the dead. She clutched the edge of the bed, staring at the still figure who had not stirred, yet through whom the voices found their passage. Her thoughts raced in fragments she could barely contain. If the rhythms of the dead could echo through this man, then his body was no ordinary patient. He was a conduit, a vessel through which lives already extinguished sought expression. The steady beat of his heart was no longer his own. It was a doorway through which past and present intertwined. The images confirmed her fears. The monitor began to flicker with static, and within the static, she saw faces. Ghostly impressions formed and dissolved, like after images burned onto the screen. Familiar profiles, hollow eyes, and mouths frozen in unfinished words appeared one after another. These were not hallucinations of a weary mind. They were captured in the machinery, replayed as if the data carried more than numbers. Each apparition dissolved into the next until the screen became an unbroken stream of lost patience. Marina could not look away. The realization struck with the force of inevitability. She had not been called to heal this man, but to witness him. He was not a victim of illness or accident. He was a vessel constructed by forces she did not yet understand, built to channel the stories of the dead into the world of the living. Her medical knowledge failed her here, stripped bare by something older, darker, and more deliberate. The room felt colder, though the machines continued to hum. She placed her hand lightly against the man's wrist, feeling the strong, steady pulse beneath his skin. It beat not only for him, but for many, perhaps for all. She withdrew her hand as though burned, unable to accept the intimacy of the revelation. The choir of heartbeats still filled the room, rising and falling in waves, until she could not tell whether it came from the machines, from the man, or from her own mind. When the first light of dawn broke through the boarded windows, the monitor's display steadied. The excess lines dissolved, leaving only a single rhythm, calm and unremarkable. The faces vanished from the screen, and the voices fell silent. But the silence did not comfort her. It felt instead like an intermission, a pause before something larger would return. Marina sat frozen in her chair, staring at the patient who slept as though untouched, while she herself felt changed beyond recognition. The idea took root, cold and undeniable. This man was not simply sleeping. He was the crossing point, the heart that carried others within it. Through him, the dead found resonance, and through her, the dead found witness. She realized then that whatever path she had begun, it could not be undone. The record of her name within the rhythms proved it. She was no longer only a doctor. She had become part of the mechanism, a link in a chain that stretched beyond the walls of medicine into something mythic and unyielding. Marina could no longer endure the role of passive observer. The pattern she had witnessed, the chorus of heartbeats echoing through the man in the nameless ward, had left her shaken, but also restless. The weight of every memory pressed on her with unbearable force. Patients she had lost over the years, their faces resurfacing in fragile glimpses on the monitor, seemed to demand more than her silence. She resolved to act, even if she did not yet understand the cost. Her first attempt was subtle. In the hospital records, she began altering dates, shifting timelines by days or weeks, as though moving pieces on an invisible board. She changed the onset of an illness here, adjusted the expected outcome of a treatment there. Small acts at first, details barely noticeable, as if testing whether her interference would ripple outward into reality. She felt the unease of a transgressor, yet also the strange conviction that her handwriting could rewrite something larger than ink and paper. The changes began to manifest almost immediately. A patient who should have collapsed in the emergency room one night instead stabilized with no clear medical explanation. Another, whose chart predicted a fatal arrhythmia, survived the crisis with a rhythm that returned to normal as though death had been postponed. Marina felt a thrill of vindication. For the first time, she believed her knowledge and her choices had shifted the inevitable. But then the balance shifted. A man admitted for a routine checkup suffered an unexpected seizure. A woman scheduled for a minor operation did not awaken from anesthesia. Their conditions had never suggested such outcomes. Marina felt the chill settle in her bones as she realized that each life saved seemed to exact a toll elsewhere. Fate, or whatever governed these exchanges, did not vanish when she intervened. It merely moved its weight from one scale to another. The man in the forgotten ward reflected her every choice. His pulse raced when she altered records, then slowed as though drained after the unanticipated deaths. Sometimes his breathing grew shallow, matching the decline of patients she had never touched. She came to see him not as a patient, but as a barometer of her defiance. His body pulsed with the consequences of her actions, recording every shift as though the machinery of destiny ran through him. Marina tried different strategies, desperate to find a loophole. She warned her colleagues of complications not yet visible, urging them to prepare equipment, to monitor patients more closely, to anticipate crises before they arose. In several instances, her caution saved lives. Yet always, within hours or days, she learned of others whose ends arrived suddenly, violently, without cause. She would pass them in the halls or glimpse their names on updated files, and her stomach would sink with the knowledge that her victory had demanded their sacrifice. Her conviction faltered. Nights grew longer, each one filled with frantic adjustments to charts, whispered advice to nurses, secret preparations in operating rooms. The more she fought, the clearer the pattern became. Her hand could nudge the course of events, but the ledger always corrected itself. Lives did not disappear from the tally. They were exchanged, transposed, written anew with different dates and faces, but never erased. She began to sense the futility of her rebellion. The sound of the monitors haunted her dreams, each beat like a judge's gavel. The man in the bed never stirred, but his presence loomed larger, his heart recording her trespasses like a silent scribe. She came to dread entering his ward, yet she returned night after night, unable to sever the bond. Every fluctuation in his pulse reminded her that she was entangled in a system that recognized her interference and absorbed it into itself. Marina's hands trembled whenever she wrote in the records. She wondered if her name, too, was already inscribed somewhere, marked by the same symbol she had seen beside her patients. Perhaps every attempt she made to outmaneuver the design only drew her closer to its center. The more she fought, the deeper she sank into the labyrinth of outcomes she could not control. By the time another dawn crept through the hospital windows, her certainty had fractured. She had saved lives. She had watched others vanish without warning. And through it all, the man in the forgotten room breathed on, his chest rising and falling in rhythm with a balance she could neither comprehend nor escape. What had once been hope now curdled into dread. She had not undone fate. She had only proven that it could not be undone. Marina had reached the edge of exhaustion. Weeks of sleepless nights had eroded her strength, and her thoughts grew heavy with the countless faces that drifted through her memory. She saw those she had managed to save, and those who had slipped away despite her desperate efforts. In her dreams, the hospital corridors stretched endlessly, filled with shadows of the departed. She awoke each time with the suffocating weight of guilt pressing against her chest. Her hands trembled when she worked, and her voice grew quieter, as though the world around her was receding. One night, her steps led her back to the old hospital wing. The corridors were darker than before, the air colder, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The same room awaited her, its door slightly open, casting a narrow line of dim light across the cracked floor tiles. Inside, the man still lay motionless on the bed, unchanged, as though time had no claim on him. Yet this time, the room was not empty. Other beds had been drawn close together, and on each one lay figures she recognized. Former patients, colleagues she had trusted, and even faces from her own family. Their bodies were still, but faint breaths rose and fell in unison, merging into a single, haunting rhythm that filled the air like a living pulse. Marina's gaze shifted to the monitor at the foot of the man's bed. Lines of names scrolled across the glowing screen, each familiar to her. Then her own name appeared, luminous and final among the others. A chill spread through her body as realization set in. She was no longer an observer standing apart from the cycle, but had been drawn into its core. Her resistance, her attempts to alter the course of lives, had only bound her closer to the mechanism she had fought against. She moved slowly to the man's side, lowering herself into the chair beside his bed. The hum of the machine seemed to grow louder, vibrating in her ears until it felt like the echo of her own heartbeat. She placed her hand on his shoulder, the flesh cold beneath her touch, and in that instant, the monitor displayed a sudden flat line. The silence that followed was complete, absolute. Her body stilled as her final breath left her, merging with the chorus of the others around her. The single lamp above the bed flickered once, then extinguished, plunging the room into darkness. The air grew heavy and unmoving, as though the hospital itself had sealed away the last traces of life. The building returned to silence, its secrets preserved, leaving only the lingering rhythm that no longer needed a voice.